I'm joined today by Richard Cahan, who is author of Un-American, The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. There's so much, Richard, to talk about with Japanese American internment during World War II in relation to 2016 and 2017. But before we do that, give us the quick sort of summary of what this internment incarceration was. I actually did one of the things you talk about in the book, which is the use of some of these words that are confusing words of incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. For people who don't know what happened, let's start there.
Great. Well, the incarceration really began on Pearl Harbor Day. Um, Within 11 weeks of Pearl Harbor, over 110,000 Japanese Americans were picked up from their homes and forcibly removed. The worry was that they were going to either collaborate or spy for the government of Japan.
Mm.
And the idea was if we could put them in what turned out to be concentration camps, the security risk would be lessened quite a bit. It began in late February with Executive Order 9066 when President Franklin Roosevelt passed an order that basically allowed the military to decide the fate of Japanese Americans. There was a lot of consternation. There wasn't a lot of formal protests. Japanese Americans pretty much saw that this was their contribution to the war effort. And I think culturally, standing up and standing against government officials was something that was unheard of, unusual at the time.
Mm.
Most of them were kept for the duration of the war, for over 3 years. Some were released during these 3 years. They could move to the Midwest, but most of them couldn't do that because they didn't have connections to the Midwest, so most of them stayed. When they were picked up, there was no idea whether they would be picked up for a week, a month, a year, forever. And so it's a very shameful part of American history. 60,000 of the 110,000, or close to 70,000, were actually U.S. citizens, people that were born in the United States. And that's why the term internment, which has been used for so many decades, is now looked down upon because you and I, American citizens, can't be interned. So it's really it's a lie of what happened. So that's why we use the word incarceration on the cover of our book and the title, and also throughout the book.
We sometimes have this sort of thought in our minds that Americans today would never allow this to happen to our neighbors or people that are fellow citizens here in the United States. But back during World War II, what was the response of neighbors to what was going on with Japanese Americans?
I look carefully at that question. I wish the news was better.
Hmm.
Were a few letters to the editor. There was one organization, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, that stood up for the Japanese Americans. But generally, there was this feeling that this was in the best interest in this country. This is really a story of when security triumphs over civil liberties. And there were many individual instances of American neighbors helping. Whenever we heard those stories, we included them in the book. People who took over farms and gave back the farms to families after the war, people who watched over possessions. But I wish there were more of those stories. There unfortunately weren't enough of them.
Let's relate what we're talking about here in terms of
Right.
Japanese Americans during World War II to what we have seen hints of under the incoming Donald Trump administration. And the one policy idea that comes to mind for me is this idea floated about a Muslim registry that would exist. Let's start more generally. I mean, what is it right to see an overlap in terms of at least the ideologies that create these ideas?
Boy, that's $1,000 question. Predicting the future is so difficult, but I will say a couple things. Number one, this is not ancient history. This happened 75 years ago. Many of the people who lived through this are still alive, so we're not talking about the Greeks or the Civil War or
Mm.
something very far away. These are actually people who live in contemporary days. There are people who doubt that something like this could happen, but the problem is even the discussion of the Muslim registry brings this up. It's been said that the incarceration is a precedent to the American to the idea of the Muslim registry. Look at this book, look at the records, and you'll see it's a very bad precedent to that. Once you start separating American citizens and saying You people are going to register, and you people don't have to register. That's when all the machinery begins. It's exactly what happened to Japanese Americans. They were first told they should register, and then within a couple of days, they were told to report. Once the registration process is started, the entire process is started. So I think we have to be very leery of what's going on now.
Is your sense that civil rights organizations are better equipped today than they were during World War II to prevent, as you say, the first steps from starting? The ACLU has been receiving record donations. We've seen a number of these organizations really be emboldened by the election of Donald Trump. Is that maybe a good sign that we have more safeguards in place?
I think it is a good sign, but it's hard to fight government when government has decided. There's already been talk of that the registry is constitutional. It's interesting that as I did my research, I looked at the early years of 1942, when the internment was being thought of. The same exact words were used, that this is constitutional. I don't know how people get to that. That this is constitutional. This is a denial of civil liberties, and but the same words are starting to be used again. It's very early I mean, the administration hasn't even begun yet, and there are people talking about this. So I'd like to say that we're more sophisticated, more determined, more set up to stop things like that. But I've seen in the past what happens when people get scared. When we get scared, we make very irrational decisions, and we make lots of mistakes. And I see people being scared now, and that's worrisome.
Not that I'm someone to point to things that the late Antonin Scalia ever said as sort of guiding principles or anything like that, but I found it interesting in preparing for our conversation that Antonin Scalia, the conservative Supreme Court justice, whose seat remains open on the Supreme Court, by the way, said a couple of years ago that, quote, "You are kidding yourself if you think the same thing," referring to incarceration camps, "will not happen again." Even he believing that it is possible that circumstances in America could lead to that again. And I think maybe not that he's someone whose morality and principles I follow, but if even Antonin Scalia recognized that this could happen again, I think that means a lot.
I agree with you. He made the point a few years ago to law students in Hawaii, and I agree. The fact that he is of a that he would recognize this, I think it's very worth noting. And I think that this book to me was a surprise, in that I saw how fast everything happened, and it's still a surprise to me how we tend not to look back at these years and recognize them. I just spent the weekend in Arizona, and there was 2 incarceration camps in Arizona, and to find these camps, to find the remains of these camps, I thought you could find anything on the internet. In one of the camps, it was absolutely impossible to find, and I had to be guided by Native Americans. Believe it or not, the camps were on Indian reservations, and Native Americans had to show me where these camps were. So there's a lot to learn from this incident and from the book here. What I think you see here, there's been many great books written on the incarceration, novels and nonfiction, but this book shows photographs, and it really takes us back to the time, and you can see what people looked like the day they were picked up, and you can see the conditions in the camps when they were taken. And I think that helps us understand. It helped me understand the situation much better.
Yeah, the photographs absolutely, disturbing and illuminating in so many ways. We've been talking about the book Un-American, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. The book's author is Richard Cahan. It's been so great speaking to you about this.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it.